It's been a few days since I've completed my experiment on the experimental extraction of the carbonate salt using only water, sodium carbonate, and vinegar. And I've had like a minimal result. I'm not sure if it's the salt I wanted or not. More informed members on Nexus mentioned it could be the calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate that precipitated out. In any case, I got around 0.1% yield from the dry weight, and I proceeded afterwards with the extraction using the normal techniques. I forgot to do the salt saturation to try to force more precipitation. But in any case, I continued with the extraction using Ethylene, and I got around 178 milligrams. So it didn't precipitate everything. If it did precipitate any of the alkaloid in the carbonate salt, in any case, I'm not really sure. But since it was too small of a yield to do a mini acid-base extraction to confirm or disprove my idea, I just did a oral biopsy. I just tested it, and since the yield was so small, only around 10 or 15 milligrams, I took it with my usual 200 milligrams of Harmalas, my Cappy tea, and it had a taste. I couldn't place my memory on the exact taste it had, but it was a familiar taste. It wasn't soapy, so it wasn't the sodium carbonate, but there was something about it. It could be calcium carbonate, as the other member mentioned. Maybe I'm remembering Tums, the antacid tablets. Maybe that's what it is, thinking back now. But I took it and I just went on with my day, and I actually completely forgot that I actually ingested anything at all. And after maybe 2 or 3 hours of feeling nothing, there was a very, very slight visual distortion. It wasn't an overlay, but a backlay of wave oscillations. It wasn't breathing, it wasn't anything like that. It was just like an overlay of waves in my complete vision. But there was no other side effects or notable traits. There was no euphoria and nothing else. And with 50 milligrams hydrochloric of this salt, I did have euphoria, very strong effects. But with the carbonate, again, this was the only effect that I had. And this was after I completely forgot about actually having taken anything. The effect was extremely minimal, and it only lasted maybe a few minutes, maybe 30 minutes tops. And it was mostly when I had nothing to do and I was sort of like zoning out that I actually noticed the effect. But there was no psychedelic effect other than this singular visual distortion. So there was a little bit of promise, and this time around I'll be attempting it again, but rather than acidifying first to try to salt it without reaching a too high pH, I'll be doing it backwards, since I think it'll work out better, and I'll give my explanation. I'll be freebasing it to a pH of around 12, so it'll be a saturated solution of sodium carbonate. And once it's freebase, I'll be adding the vinegar slowly until the same pH of around 7.5 pH. and try not to do under 7. And the logic behind the reverse for the salting is with the original plan where it's a vinegar solution, there's going to be a ton of acetate ions in the water solution, and the reverse will be mostly carbonate ions in the solution, and you'll be neutralizing it with the acetate ions. Again, I'm not a chemist at all. I have very little chemistry understanding, but in my mind that makes more sense. But yeah, I'll be doing that, and if it fails again, I could just continue on with a regular extraction. And at the same time, I'm just doing a side experiment that I do believe most people overlooked in my longer increasing biosynthesis videos. The first part is what got the most views and attention, where I go through each step of the biosynthesis. And again, I do want to test the ethylene portion of that theory first, and I'll be using this Birdgezi in the future to do that. I'll have a control, the ethylene portion, and one more. And for the third theory that I'm going to test, it's part of the second video of the part 2 on the biosynthesis increasing, and it was mostly on what the alkaloids actually are in the plants. Usually the first response is, oh, they're a defensive mechanism, but from my research it seems that it's mostly a defense, but not from herbivores, but from the actual plant stressors itself. As a plant is stressed with drought, sunlight, UV, insects, what have you, the plant releases oxides, either hydrogen peroxide, superoxide, and like a whole bunch of different radicals that will inevitably kill the plant if it can't reduce the amount. And it's ROS, that's the abbreviation. It's reactive oxygen something to that nature. And that video didn't get much views, but it stuck with me because it affects every single plant and not just the biosynthesis of mescaline cacti specifically, but every single plant and every single alkaloid falls under that scope of the ROS response. And I didn't mention it with my previous 2 extractions, but I did, besides the drought period, I was spraying daily with a 3% hydrogen peroxide solution, and I think that it did work. Again, I need a control for this, but the yields were very impressive. And I did the same with this current cutting. This is my number 2 clone. This is my Birdgezi 1, 2, 3, and then the other one that had so far the best yield, I'll just name it 4. But in this Birdgezi 2, it's currently in a 3% hydrogen peroxide solution, just so that it doesn't get dry for whatever reason. But I'm not saying that just soaking it in hydrogen peroxide is going to increase the biosynthesis, but a constant application at a low enough rate, or even a bit higher maybe, of dosing the plant, it'll increase the biosynthesis gradually over the period. What I tested without a control is 30 days. This one was only 7 days. And again, there's no control, and I don't know the previous yield on this since I failed with the silo in the past. But if it does have a very promising yield, I do want to experiment with this more. So again, I just sprayed 3% hydrogen peroxide. I'm not watering it heavily, It did get watering last week, but the main thing is a foliar spray of hydrogen peroxide. And the idea is that so that the plant isn't stressed excessively and doesn't die, it'll create alkaloids to relieve its stressing. And I'll be testing with this. This came out to close to 290 grams wet, and I'll be drying it. Another thing I want to show in this video is a quicker way to dry the cacti. What I'll be doing here is just cutting it into slivers and then cutting it smaller, and I'll be placing it in a dish or a plate that's microwave safe, and I'll be doing 1 minute bursts until it steams, and each 1 minute burst I'll decant any mucus and liquid that's in the dish. And I do that, and within maybe 15 minutes I'm able to completely dry the cutting. So this is 15 minutes with around 300 grams. So with a kilo it'll take maybe an hour to dry completely. And this is much faster than using a dehydrator or even an oven, which I've done in the past. So I'm just sharing that with my viewers, since you guys it seems to follow my experiments. And with the decanted water that I remove the mucus and the water, I just keep it separate. I don't dry it completely, since I just want to get the dry weight of the cactus itself. It probably does add a few milligrams or even a few grams, depending on the size, to the final dry weight, but it'll be a minimal difference. It shouldn't be too much. And the cutting that shows the most promise is this cutting. I've done a previous cutting in the past, and the yield, again, before I attempted silo, and the yields were immeasurable because of just errors on my part and inexperience. But this cutting, this clone, it had 3 other side pups, and in total they measured 20 inches in length, but they were still very thin. Excuse me. And again, I did the month-long drought period that I do for spring, and during that period I was spraying daily with the 3% hydrogen peroxide solution. And I harvested, you can check the monthly updates, and you'll see the thinner Bridgesi. I'm just naming it 4 because of its location. And this Bridgesi yields around 2% of an impure hydrogen peroxide, or hydrogen chloride. Hydrogen chloride. It yielded 2%, and then after a cleanup, it came out to around 1.7% yield of the hydrogen chloride salt. So far it's my best yielding. My Peruvianus, it yielded 0.8%, but it was a 0.8% of the very refined and pure hydrogen chloride salt with the isopropanol washing step. It was a bit more, but most people don't tend to count the other alkaloids that they pull with the cash extraction. So this blue Peruvianus was around 0.8, and this one yielded around 2. And we'll see how the others do. And even this thin cutting would have a yield that's significant. And in the end, the 20 inches had around 12 grams dry of material.